Caught in the crossfire, are civilians being unfairly targeted from above in the Trump government's war on terror? I'm Imran Garta, and today on The Newsmakers, we look at who is paying the price for America's shadow war in Somalia. It's impossible to know exactly how many civilians have been killed in Somalia since U.S. military operations began in the 1970s, but it's likely in the thousands. Airstrikes have tripled under President Donald Trump and now exceed those in Yemen and Libya combined. After years of denial and only under international pressure, did the current administration admit U.S. Reaper drone and manned aircraft attacks have killed Somali civilians. Then there are the threats on the ground. A third of Somalia's population relies on food aid, and the threat of al-Shabaab looms. Armed fighters operate like a shadow government in the areas they control, collecting taxes and ruling brutally. The U.S. says its operations weaken the insurgency. Others say it's helping fuel it. Amnesty International says there's a shroud of secrecy surrounding civilian deaths that masks possible war crimes, calling it a smokescreen for impunity. But while numbers are debated and reporting methods questioned, thousands of civilians continue to run for their lives. Adam Pletz went to Somalia to speak to some of them.
We've come to this IDP camp in central Mogadishu to meet a woman because she's told us she left her village precisely because of a drone attack.
waxaan ka soo qaxay shabeellada hoose waxaana soo duqeeyay diyaarado daroonis waxa iga dhintay aniga wiilkayga iyo gabadhayda wiilka qabo iyo walaalkay wiilkiisa saddexdaas wax alla wixii aan haysanay waa gubtay waa soo baxnay waxaan imaanay.
Halimo says none of her relatives were al-Shabaab members, and she has no doubt who carried out the strike.
diyaarada Mareykanka waayo daroonis ilaa hadda weli waa duqeynayaan mas'uulka Mareykanka ka ahay Mareykan diyaarada Mareykanka lahay bal doogley ka soo kacaan daroonis waayo.
But even if she's confident her relatives were killed in a US strike this March, she says there's no way for her grievances to be addressed.
annaga wax aan cadaalad ku samayn karno ma jirto dad ayagoo jiifa habeen madow diyaarad duqeeyay maxay cadaalad ku raadiyaan waxaan ku raadi karnaa cadaalad.
It's a question that has nearly always been met with denials of any responsibility from the US military.
ilaahay baa qaban kara ilaahay.
According to the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, Washington has carried out 139 drone attacks in Somalia since 2007. They've killed at least 965 people. Only in April did the US admit its first 2 civilian fatalities from these attacks. Both the Bureau of Investigative Journalism and Amnesty International have reported the number could be much higher. The US was the first country to develop armed drones, but at least 30 nations now have these unmanned planes, and 10 have used them in conflict. Non-state actors, including terrorist groups, also have drones, and with their proliferation, the question of accountability is by no means limited to the US. This was your patient a couple of months ago. Back in Mogadishu, we visit a doctor and his patient, who says he was shot in an attack involving drones and ground forces.
dhibka u dhacay dhib culus ayuu ahaa xabad ayaa liiga soo saaray dusho mid kale dhabarka ayaa iga gashay waxay ka soo baxday naaska iyo garabka kala dhaxlahooda diyaarada ayaana yeelay diyaaradaha xilli oo cawo ay noo imaadeen annagoo saaxanay.
Osman says the attack took place on March the 7th at his village in the Lower Shabelle region, and there were no al-Shabaab terrorists there. In response to questioning from TRT World Research Center, the US military has said Somali forces conducted an operation against al-Shabaab on March the 7th in the Lower Shabelle. It did not confirm or deny US participation. Osman insists the attack involved airstrikes, a capability that Somali forces simply don't have. Investigating claims that civilian deaths have been caused by drones in any conflict zone is challenging. But is the very fact that these attacks are so difficult to investigate, allowing those countries that carry out drone strikes to do so with impunity? Adam Pletz, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, let's go to our panel. Joining me from Washington, D.C. is retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt. He's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State who served in Iraq. And from Kansas City is Daniel Mahanty, the Director of the Center for Civilians in Conflict U.S. program. And from Buffalo, New York, Brian Castner joins us. He's the Senior Crisis Advisor on Arms and Military Operations for Amnesty International and the author of Amnesty's latest report on American airstrikes in Somalia. Good to have you all on the program. Brian Castner, let's start with you. From your perspective as Amnesty International, is there enough evidence to suggest that the U.S. is deliberately, knowingly killing civilians in Somalia and possibly covering it up?
So we were only able to investigate about 5 cases in the lower Shabelle region outside of Mogadishu. And that's because, as your piece points out, it is extremely difficult to investigate these cases and get access. But in the ones that we were able to find just around Mogadishu, it is clear that the U.S. often doesn't know who it is killing. It is killing some people it thinks that are al-Shabaab. It's killing other young men who are maybe nearby. But just because you're a young man who happens to be near an al-Shabaab vehicle doesn't make you al-Shabaab yourself. And so this is why we're calling for more of an investigation and for AFRICOM to go through all of these cases, because they really haven't positively identified who these people are. And people that they categorize as terrorists or al-Shabaab are often no such thing.
General Kimmitt, the U.S. often doesn't know who it's killing. Can you accept that?
Well, look, I don't think any time you do these kind of operations will you know 100% of the time who you're going after. But you can be assured that with significant confidence, the intelligence that is being used before a drone strike is carried out is high. The fact remains that it's not 100% perfect, but knowing the targeting process that is used, knowing the time that targets are waved off because they can't be assured to a very significant degree that the target is hostile, and knowing that system for years and years, I think it's a reasonable system that is currently being used, and one that I would challenge anybody to come up with a better system.
Brian, are they open to investigation? Are they transparent when you ask questions?
Well, this is our frustration. I mean, the general's right that it, you know, that maybe ahead of time, I believe that they're using the best intelligence that they can before the strike. But then the question is, after the strike, do they go back and check who they killed or not? Do they do the investigation to say, okay, well, who actually were these people in this truck? And when we have taken information to AFRICOM to ask them to reinvestigate, where it's clear that after our work of a month or two of searching through, talking to people, talking to witnesses, usually the witnesses and the family members say we're the first people that they've talked to about the incidents. AFRICOM has not spoken to them. We know more about the cases than they do often, than AFRICOM does by the time we're done. And so then we're asking them to go back. And they said they've been conducting this full review since the spring, but we've received no update even when we've asked.
Daniel Mahanty, is that consistent with what you know, that there's very little follow-up, especially when there are reports of civilian casualties?
Yeah, I think the combination of the general's comments and Brian's comments kind of, characterize what we've seen in terms of AFRICOM's response in both its strengths and its shortcomings. On the one hand, to their credit, they have a procedure that allows for the receipt of information, and they're willing to take a look at any allegation that comes their way. And if organizations provide them with, additional information that changes their mind, they're willing to take a second look. Where we have some frustration, or where we try to engage them or prevail upon them to do a little bit more, is the extent to which they themselves are looking into incidents independent of information that's provided to them by outside organizations. It's using resources and capabilities available to the U.S. government to take a harder look at what happened. And I think there are some some limitations that they encounter that we have to acknowledge in terms of security and access. But at the same time, if they're not able to conduct those reviews on their own, it does call into question the degree of confidence they should have in the targeting process to begin with.
Mark Kimmitt, can we trust them to investigate themselves, or is there an institutional reluctance to admit fault?
No, I don't think there's any institutional reluctance to admit fault. And we've done that in the past. We've done that in Iraq. We've done that in Afghanistan. There is no harm and there is no penalty for accepting the fact that mistakes were made. That's human nature. But again, the process is such that they go through extraordinarily extensive analysis before they execute those targets. Unfortunately, there are humans involved in the situation, there are humans involved in the process, and mistakes sometimes are made. It's grievous every time an innocent civilian is killed, but I'm not sure at this point that there is a better way to do this than is being employed right now.
Brian Castner, suggest a better way.
Well, you know, at Amnesty, we're trying not to give, we don't tell the U.S. government or any government how to fight its wars and how it should be doing it instead. What we ask them to do is accept the consequences of their actions and then admit fault and pay reparations when possible, and when there is an incident. As the general points out, this, you know, the U.S. government did this in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I want to stress this. What Amnesty International is calling for is nothing different than the U.S. government did in Iraq and Afghanistan at the height of the surges there. I believe AFRICOM says that they've conducted 48 or 49 airstrikes this year. Back at the height of the surge, the U.S. government would do 48 airstrikes a day in Iraq or Afghanistan. And somehow local battalion commanders at that time were able to go to families, interview people, you know, investigate whether civilians were harmed, and often paid compensation or admitted fault. And that's what we're asking here. As your piece pointed out, if you're a poor farmer in rural Somalia and your cousin was killed in an airstrike, you currently do not have a way to tell the U.S. government or the Somali government that your cousin was killed. And that's, I think that would be a huge step forward, is to simply give civilians a place to go and say, this happened to me. And then, you know, if Amnesty International can investigate these strikes, then the U.S. government, with all of its resources, it can do the same thing.
Daniel Mahanty, the fact that there isn't that place to go to, what does that say about these, what some people call shadow wars or dirty wars?
Well, I think it remains an unfortunate and persistent problem, not only in Somalia, but elsewhere, that civilians simply don't have the channel through which they can communicate their grievances or their complaints. And I think from the military's perspective, they would say, well, it's not hard to find us. You know, at AFRICOM, for example, we have an email address. But the fact of the matter is, for people living in the lower Shabelle who don't have access to technology or perhaps could put themselves at risk by using something like an email system, you know, the military, and I think the U.S. government more broadly, to include the State Department, has to be more creative about making sure that people can contact them. In fact, a simple procedural change would just be in their standard operating procedure in response to civilian casualties claims that they get from organizations like Amnesty, would be to follow up to say, look, do witnesses or do survivors wish to be in touch with us? Because if they do, then I think it's incumbent upon them to actually take that step.
Okay, I'm going to broaden this out in a couple of moments, right? But I want to stay with Somalia for the moment and ask General Kimmitt, when we look at the tactic from the United States using the Reaper drones and the manned aircraft, yes, they are there at the invitation of the Somali government. But we read the news and we see that less than 24 hours ago, at least 20 Somali soldiers were killed, 18 others wounded, when al-Shabaab raided a military base south of Mogadishu. I guess it helps us understand what the Somali government is up against and what the United States is up against, right? Because they had a suicide car bomb and then a gun attack. Following that, they briefly took over the base. That's the one angle to this. But the other angle might suggest, hey, you're raining down missiles on these guys, yet they're still capable of conducting this type of attack. Maybe it's not working. Is that fair?
Well, first of all, let me say I agree with both Brian and your colleague from Amnesty International. We would like to see a better process for paying what we call salatial payments to the unintended victims of these strikes. It does no good to us to avoid the fact or ignore the fact that there are penalties and there are costs to civilians that are unintentionally caught up in this. Now, as to your comments about the al-Shabaab, I think it's important to recognize that in general, drone strikes are not used for large formations, for large groupings, large training centers. Primarily, they go against single high-value targets or a couple of high-value targets. Now, it is certainly the case that we use armed aircraft against some of those facilities, but you're right. I mean, this is a long war, and you're also right that, in fact, some of these strikes create more terrorists than they kill. This is perplexing. This is what we have to acknowledge. But I don't think anybody is going to suggest that warfare from the air is going to end this conflict. That theory of winning a war from airstrikes alone has been disputed since 1930 when the book came out on this.
Right.
So it has to be followed up not simply by airstrikes, but by other operations as well.
So Daniel Mahanty, all things considered, have the airstrikes in Somalia helped degrade the capability of al-Shabaab?
Well, I think that's a question that's best left to people who deal with matters of strategy. I don't think my organization, Center for Civilians in Conflict, would render a judgment on the strategic effectiveness of the use of air power in degrading al-Shabaab's capabilities. So I'd defer that question to someone from government.
Okay, fair enough, fair enough. Let's broaden this out. I want to touch on some of the numbers beyond Somalia and look at some of the similar tactics being used by the United States. According to the United Nations, in Afghanistan, 363 civilians have been killed in the first half of 2019. And in Iraq and Syria, at least 1,302 civilians have been killed by US-led coalition forces between August 2014 and April 2019. That's according to Amnesty International. Now, of course, we have numbers for Libya, for Yemen as well, from multiple sources, from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism and so on. We're going to stick with the UN and Amnesty numbers for now. But Brian Castner, there seems to be a general pattern here, would you agree, that there is impunity not just in Somalia, but elsewhere as well when it comes to civilians who lose their lives when death is rained upon them from above?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're identifying a pattern here where the U.S. government is fighting a war in a certain way that ensures that its own soldiers are not put on the ground. As an American and as former military myself, I understand why that is. But there are inherent problems in fighting a war like this. One, the difficulty in knowing who you're killing. Number two, investigating afterwards and confirming who it was. There's some basic intelligence problems. This is intelligence work 101. If you use the same platform, the aircraft, to positively identify your target as you do to verify who you killed afterwards, there's a pretty good chance that if you were wrong before the strike, you're still wrong after the strike. And this is the extent of the investigation that's being done in places where the U.S. government, doesn't have forces on the ground, is not able to do its own follow-up. And so I admit it's frustrating that groups like Amnesty and CIVIC and others are the ones, we come in afterwards and we try to do investigation that seems like the U.S. government should be doing itself.
Right.
In each of those countries that you mentioned.
And General Kimmitt, we've had this discussion before about Mosul, about Raqqa and so on, right? When it comes to airstrikes, when it comes to mortar attacks, you led battalions in places like Fallujah. This is different this time around because there are no boots on the ground. Is the general principle or the general practice that maybe the United States is a bit looser when it comes to consequences and accountability, and there's less care about consequences when you're not fighting the war with boots on the ground, when you're only fighting it from above?
Oh, I don't think so. I think inflammatory language like death from above doesn't really help the whole discussion, what we're trying to do. I think you may be disappointed, but there seems to be general agreement between Brian, our colleague in Amnesty International, that in general, we are trying to do as much as possible to reduce to the greatest extent possible the number of civilian casualties.
Okay.
There will be mistakes made.
When we talk about dead civilians,
and let me finish.
It's death from above.
And let me finish.
I don't see what's inflammatory about that.
Oh, for goodness sakes.
If you've been killed by an airstrike, if you're a civilian and you've been killed by an airstrike, I don't see how calling it death from above is inflammatory. But please continue.
Okay, well, let me suggest what you do is you talk about unintended consequences of drone attacks.
My job is not to.
The strategic
my job is not to put a
try to
spin
reduce the
to it,
casualties as much as possible.
My job is not to put a spin.
But
to
you
it.
are putting a spin on it.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Finish
But
your point.
exactly that. You wouldn't be doing a television show on this if you weren't putting a spin on this. But let's get to the fundamental issue. It doesn't matter if 1,000 were killed or 100 are killed. One civilian casualty is too many. And we do everything we can within the constraints that are imposed. But to suggest that somehow because we're using drones, we're a little more slipshod with our tactics, that's just simply not the case. I think collectively the professionals in this discussion want to try to do and use every bit of technology. We would certainly like to investigate every situation on the ground. Sometimes we can't. We will continue to try to improve the situation to minimize, but there hasn't been a clean war in the history of warfare. But I would suggest the number of civilian casualties in these types of operations are significantly, dramatically less than, say, the 30,000 that were killed in one night in a firebombing of Dresden. It's not perfect. We attempt to make it as good as possible, but again, it never will be.
I understood, but tens of millions of people died in World War II, right? So to use that as a metric, it would mean that everything seems relatively clean these days and nobody's really doing anything wrong, right? But I want to ask Brian Castner about whistleblowers.
Not at all. It's a matter of scale, Imran.
Okay,
it's
certainly, but tens
scale.
of millions of people died in World War II. We can talk about, I don't know, Leningrad, Stalingrad, Dresden, and so on. We can do these things, and everything else would look somewhat rosy by comparison.
And because of that, we spend billions of dollars to develop weapons that don't rely on dumb technology that would require killing a number of civilians for the purposes of maintaining defense to the country.
Sure.
We're trying to do it to the extent possible.
Civilians are
Zero is not attainable.
Certainly. Civilians are still dying. That's why we're having this conversation. Certainly. Right. Brian Castner, I want to talk about the role of whistleblowers here, because interestingly, in May, there was an indictment in the US. It was unsealed. Federal prosecutors used the Espionage Act, which is basically from World War I, right, to charge a 31-year-old former US intelligence analyst, Daniel Hale, with theft of government property. The theory goes, even though we don't have all the information, but it seems as if he was the source for Jeremy Scahill's drone papers in 2015, right? And the Trump administration's going quite hard at him. What does this tell us about whistleblowers and those who are from the inside trying to give us more information about how these wars are fought from above?
Yeah, I think what it says generally, because I can't talk to the specifics of that case, but what it says generally is that you know, the front or the message that General Kimmitt talks about, that we're doing everything we can and we wish we could do more, is not as true in the inside. It's a good, I mean, it's a good message, but we can, at Amnesty, we can give very specific cases where the U.S. is not doing everything it could. If the U.S. was doing everything it could, it would follow up with the cases and the families that we've investigated. They would admit fault, they would do their own investigation, they would put their money where their mouth is and actually following up with these instead of just saying, well, we're doing the best we can up front. I'm not even sure that's true. Again, you know, it's clear that after these strikes that we're able to identify that, you know, in many cases, people who just happened to be nearby were classified as al-Shabaab. This is not a technical problem. The U.S. tries to solve a lot of problems with more technology, and this is a case of analysts and intelligence and saying, do we know who we're shooting or do we not? And then choosing to make a different decision and not take a shot or not classify people as al-Shabaab beforehand and afterwards when there are no such things. The U.S. could be doing more, and I think that, like you point out, the reason the whistleblowers come out is because of frustration that the story on the inside is different than the story on the outside.
Daniel Mahanty, are we getting closer to accountability?
Well, it's a really good question. I think there's a moment of opportunity right now where the Congress is involved, and I think there are some good people at the Pentagon and throughout the military who want to bring the military closer to accountability. But one thing that stands in the way, I'm afraid, is kind of this tenor of defensiveness and this competence bias that the military has, that they are doing everything they can. instead of taking a serious introspective look to say, look, could we be doing more, and under what circumstances could we be doing more, and how could we be doing more to reduce the overall number? It's simply too high. The airstrike on the pine nut farm
right.
in Afghanistan today was met with, it's not our fault, it's the Taliban's fault, and look how many people they're killing. And really, I spent 15 years in the government, and I think, I would prefer that the U.S. government would be a little bit more modest in its overall assessment, because it's important for the Taliban or the warfighting effort, but because for the people who are killed, to hear that the U.S. government is taking a closer look and doing something more as a result of the casualties that have occurred sends an important message.
Gentlemen, this has been an important conversation to have, and I thank you all for joining us. Mark Kimmitt, Daniel Mahanty, and Brian Castner, thanks so much for joining us here on The Newsmakers.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for joining us here on this episode of The Newsmakers.